and thanks for your service. Inspector General Horowitz, you and I have had this conversation before where I've made the analogy, which I think is a pretty accurate analogy, to independent auditors that are appointed by the board, oftentimes selected by the CEO, and they are meant to provide information to the board of directors who report to the shareholders. You know, is everything on the up and up in the corporation? So, you know, I kind of look at Inspector Generals the exact same way. And when I hear independent, you know, I'm just asking the question: independent of who? Who should Inspector Generals be independent of?
So, yeah, and we've had this discussion, and I appreciate it. And as you know from our discussion, I've, in private practice, represented and worked with audit committees and independent auditors. And I think the answer on that is independent of the agency leadership from being able to take personnel action against them. That's the system Congress set up. And now I'm going to talk about presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed IGs, like in my position. The setup that Congress created was to allow me to operate without fear that the agency leadership can respond in a personnel action against me. I can, of course, be removed at will by the president, and that's entirely appropriate, and none of this legislation changes that.
Okay, so again, it's independent of the agencies, right, but Inspector Generals report to the president. They serve at his pleasure, correct?
That's correct.
Unfortunately, over the years, and I've experienced this firsthand as chairman of this committee, trying to undertake investigations, issuing subpoenas, for example, to the FBI, that were largely ignored, slow-walked. You know, congressional oversight has been dramatically weakened because we have no enforcement mechanisms. So it seems like we've outsourced our oversight, the people's oversight, the people's direct oversight into these agencies to Inspector Generals. And I am concerned that Inspector Generals, when they take a look at that independent moniker, they're thinking that's independent of everybody. The President of the United States is held accountable to the voters. If he dismisses an Inspector General, the voters will hold the President accountable. So I am concerned about the thrust of, you know, all the requirements imposed by Congress. Again, we've relied on Inspector Generals, and I appreciate the work. I've also worked with Inspector Generals who tried to, that were corrupt and had to leave. Okay, and I think you know, our other witnesses are aware of that as well. The inspections they're having to do on Inspector Generals. So I think this is important to keep in mind, that it's the Inspector Generals report to the President. They don't report to Congress. We use them, but my solution would be to beef up, reclaim congressional oversight power, which we have allowed to lapse, and we've outsourced that to Inspector General. Do you understand that assessment? Not agree or disagree, but do you understand where I'm coming from there?
Well, look, I certainly understand the concern you outline about what the congressional oversight responsibilities are and how they've been executed. I'll just say, this legislation changes nothing about the president's ability to remove an IG. There is no for-cause provision here. There is none of that. And to your point, as SIGI chair, one of the things, and Allison has continued this, I know, as chair, I talk about this all the time with not only my folks at DOJ OIG, but with other IGs. We're not free-range actors. I agree with you completely. We are in a constitutional system. We follow the IG Act. We follow the law. What I think the legislation does, though, particularly with the Vacancies Act, is it doesn't limit the president's ability to remove. The president can remove whomever the president wants.
Just puts reporting requirements on them.
It does, well, on the...
So again, I've got some other issues. So,
okay.
One example, I think a glaring example in terms of the weakening of congressional oversight is, for example, under a FOIA request, over 4,000 of Dr. Fauci's emails were provided to an outside group. Now, Congress is not subject to the redactions of that information that, again, they were forced to give to an outside group. We asked for those, 5 of us on this committee. using a law that says the agency shall turn over this information. We were asking for new documents. We were just asking for the 4,000 pages unredacted. We haven't gotten them unredacted. We're getting them now in dribs and drab, just little bits and pieces, a couple pages at a time, in camera. I think that's wrong. I do want to, before I run out of time here, though, because I haven't been able to talk to you about this, since I was chair and since you issued your FISA report. In your FISA report, you talked about how, and this was in the main body of the report, how Bill Priestap had told you, quote, that the FBI didn't have any indication whatsoever by May 2017 that Russians were running a disinformation campaign through the Steele election reporting. And that was in your FISA report, correct?
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me,
Okay.
but I trust your...
It was. It took us months and a battle to unredact redacted footnotes that completely are contrary to that. And I don't want to take time to quote that, but that's in the public record, and you're aware of these footnotes.
Yep.
The question I have for you is, I see nothing in these footnotes that should have been classified or even subject to redaction. Why were those redacted?
So I'd have to go back and look at the specific footnotes, and I'm working on memory, but just on this and all our other reports, we send this to the FBI and the Justice Department leadership, and they ultimately make the call, and I am not the person who's going to put out information they say is classified, obviously, and risk getting prosecuted for doing that.
So again, what I was trying to point out here, this was further cover-up by the FBI and the Department of Justice, wanting to make sure that it wasn't in the public domain very early on. They knew that people that were sourced to the Steele dossier had contacts with Russian intelligence services. They knew this as early as October 2016 and January 2016, and yet the FBI and the Mueller investigation continued to plod forward and put this country through the political turmoil of the Mueller investigation, even though they knew the source document that prompted the investigation, the corrupt investigation, was very likely a product, or certainly part of a product, of Russian disinformation. That's an accurate assessment, isn't it?
Well, I'll just add, there are many reasons why, as we detail in the report, there should have been greater follow-up and skepticism about reporting. So I
will say every step of the way in my investigation, I was frustrated by members of this committee, but by FBI Director Wray that did not comply with my subpoenas. As a result, the American public was kept in the dark about this. I think, and my final point is, congressional oversight capability must be beefed up. As important as IG reforms are and making sure that you can operate independently and uncover corruption within agencies to report to the president, Congress needs the oversight ability to report to the American public.
And,
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
And can I just
Quickly,
on
please.
the Senator's point, because I do think it's relevant to today's discussion as well, because as many of the members know who were here over the last 10 years, certainly in my first few years, and Senator Johnson chaired, I think, some of these hearings where we talked about my inability to get records. And at the time, just to be clear, one of the area that was off limits to me, supposedly, was FISA records back in the day, as you'll recall. The only reason that changed is because this committee, Senator Grassley, and the House moved the IG Empowerment Act legislation in 2016 that overturned the OLC opinion, the FBI's position, and gave us access to that. If we didn't have the access to the records, you wouldn't have even had our 600-page report about FISA, because I couldn't have done it. And that's why the reforms here are so important for us to be able to do.
Thank
Thank you.
you, Mr.